Hey everyone, I wanted to go over a couple of our last geometry creation tools, and then we will talk about using our duplicate tools to get the most out of the geometry that we've made. First, let's just jump into the text tool here. The text tool will let me essentially add text into my scene. Now, by default, you might not see any text here. So you would hit the K key to go into properties and type in whatever you want here. So if it was text, test text 2, and I click in the viewport, that's going to update it for me. So I'm going to pin this open. I'm also going to be able to change my font. If you have a font that you want to use that's not kind of coming with your system, you can download a font from the internet and just install it. But if you do install a font, you will have to restart Modo for it to show up in this list, okay? You also want to be a little bit careful about which fonts you use because some of the let's see if I can find one. Actually had one before. Undo, right there. So some of these fonts that are kind of more complicated will have weird geometry issues like that. So just double check after you've created an object here. Some of the other options we have is the size, which we can always change by scaling later. The tracking, which is the space between letters. Let me actually go to a better font here. Alright, so the tracking is going to be the spacing between letters. The position is just going to be where this object is in 3D space. Location is where the text is relative to that, relative to that position. We also have justification, which is also relative to that position. Doesn't always matter, mainly because you are going to be able to move the geometry later anyway. But if you keep it on middle and center, the center of your mesh item will be the center of your text. Okay. Now output type, we always want to leave this on text polygon. Bezier will just give you curves, which we'll touch on in a bit. But you want to leave it as text polygon, and then you have the option to split. And by default, it's going to split it by line, meaning that the entire line will be one polygon, even though it's not connected. You can split by word, in which case each word will be a separate polygon, and you can split by character, which is each letter will be a separate polygon, right? For my purpose, I'll only need it as a line. If I was like doing multiple lines or multiple words as different objects, I tend to make different mesh items and just draw the text into, or use the text tool to add text into different mesh items. But we can always split this up later, which we'll touch on in a second. So I'm going to hit spacebar to get out of this tool now. And you'll notice if I go to polygon mode, select it, it's all one polygon, even though it's not connected, right? The other thing you'll notice is there is no shading information on the back here. So it is a flat single polygon. And what we'll have to do to get around that is first and foremost, extrude it. So I'm going to go to my polygon tools, extrude, click in my viewport, and just pull that forward a little bit. And you're going to see it gives me my 3D shape and my back polygon. Okay. Now, I can treat this however I want. If I wanted to split this up, the easiest way I would do this, let's say I wanted the word text in a new polygon, I double clicked each island to select it. I'm going to press the N key on my keyboard to create a new empty mesh item and just paste that in. Whoops, I did not copy it. So let me go back here. Let's double click all this. I'm holding down shift. I'm going to control X to cut it. I'm going to go into this one and control V to paste it. I'm going to do the same with the number 2 here. So back in my original mesh, cut, N key, paste, right? Now in all 3 of these, I would probably want to go to edit, center to bounding box center. You can see I can't do that with all of them selected, so let's do one at a time. Edit, center to bounding box, item mode. Let's try that again. Edit, center to bounding box center. Actually, it should let me do both of them at the same time if I am in item mode. So let's just check. Yep, that looks good. And yep, that looks good. Okay. So now we have these three items. I'm going to turn on make inactive same as active, just so I can see it all. All right. The other thing that we can, other create tool that we have here. First of all, if you were to delete a polygon, let's say, let me do this on something simpler, just because on text it could be a little bit complicated. If I was to delete a polygon and I want to fill that polygon in, I can select these edges and hit the P key, not the O key, the P key, and it will fill in that polygon. Okay. Just so you know, when you do have a deleted edge like that, usually double clicking on one of the side edges will select the entire kind of circle or shape around that open edge, and hit the P key again, that'll close it up. If I was to, let's say, delete half of this, and then I double click on this edge and hit the P key, should fill that in pretty nicely. Alright. So just remember P for polygon, and that'll get you pretty far. Okay, back to our create tools here. So that's the text tool. I'm going to hide these. Actually, before I hide these, let's talk about grouping. So I'm going to select these three items, hit Control G, and it's going to create a group locator, which is essentially a folder with those objects in it. The group locator will also have its own center, so I can use that as an item to animate and move things around, and I can also hide the entire group kind of easily, right? Remember, you also want to rename these guys, so let's say text group. Let me turn that back on. So this is my text. This is the word test, and this is the word number 2. All right, so I'm just gonna close that up, minimize or hide that, and I'm going to create a new mesh item. So N key, new empty mesh item, and I'm going to talk about these curve tools. So first thing you want to know is that we have the regular curve tool, we have a Bezier curve tool, which has handles kind of like you might be used to from Photoshop or Illustrator, and we have a B-spline curve, and then we have a sketch tool. Alright, so let's just quickly look at these in a top view. So I'm going to first just use the sketch tool, and you'll see that kind of gives me this kind of line with a lot of edges faceted throughout it, but as soon as I let go of my mouse, it's going to kind of smooth that out. Alright, and in this case I only have these two points. The second one will let me kind of scale and rotate. The first one will let me move it around. I tend to not love that one, so I'm going to actually look at these other ones. So the regular curve tool here is going to let you draw out a curve, and you can kind of click and move your mouse to see what result it does. Your click will always kind of affect the 2 points before it a little bit. Now you can see if I click again, it's just going to add to the end of my curve. But if I wanted to add a point between these two, I can select the first one over here and then click, and it's always going to add a point after the highlighted point. Right? So if I select this one again and click, it's going to add a point after that. If I go to my properties here, oops, I just dropped that. Let me redraw that. So empty mesh item, curve tool, right? If I go to my tool properties here, I do have the option to close the curve, which will essentially just join that last point to the first point. All right. You also have the option to delete a point. So if I change this to delete and click on that, it's going to delete that point. Edit is just going to let me move them around, and add, whoops, will let me add a point after the highlighted point, right? All right, so closed will close that in, and filled, let me full screen this guy. So filled will essentially give you a polygon there, right? But I would not really rely on this as a polygon because, you know, typically a polygon has straight edges like that. And you can actually see, even as it is right now, there's one polygon, but it says mixed, and it can cause some issues when we're making other geometry. So I tend to not use the curve tools to create geometry right away like that. We'll talk about their actual use in a second. Let me just look at some of these other options here. So the Bezier tool here, Bezier curve, will let me draw these points kind of more like in Illustrator or Photoshop. And if I click and click, it's going to give me a hard corner. If I click and drag, it's going to soften that corner. I can also select the previous point and then play around with these handles to change the curvature at that point. All right, I can kind of, let me actually see if I can do this here. Yeah, I also have the option to close this, right? Just join that first and last point. I can still draw a new point in. If I select this and I click, it's going to draw a point after the highlighted point, and I can still go in and delete points. You don't want to use the delete tool here because I think if you hit delete on the keyboard, it will delete the mesh item. I remember having issues with that, so just know that you want to actually go to delete in the tool properties and then select the point that you want to delete. All right. And then we have the B-spline curves. Now, whenever you draw a curve, you kind of want them in separate mesh items. So I'm going to hit N and draw in a new item. And this one is going to essentially, as soon as I have 4 points, start drawing out a curve. And it's a different calculation that some people are a little bit more comfortable using, but it's just another way to get a shape. And the same applies here, where if we want to add a point, select the previous point and add a point after that. If I want to delete, just select them here, delete, and if I want to close it, I can close it. All right. Now, before we talk about what we can actually do with these curves, I do want to mention that if you're trying to just get a polygon, we do have the pen tool right here. And so in a new mesh item, I'm going to click, and as soon as I have 3 points, it's going to create a polygon, and then I can go in and draw out a shape. So for example, a lot of people will use this to do, let's say, the start of a kind of guitar body, where you want to have that bass go in, kind of come out, and maybe something like that. And then of course you can, fine tune this, or you can use a picture to get a better reference of your shape. Right. And that's more like a fish or a duck. But you can go in and fine tune this however you want. Oops. And again, you should usually use references. You'll also notice that the pen tool is going to, by default, close the polygon, right? Because you are drawing a single polygon. But let's say we have that shape. Actually, it looks more like a bullet bill kind of thing. We can take this, and just like our text tool, we can go to our polygon mode, extrude, or polygon tools and extrude, and then have like a shape to start out with, right? Kind of goldfishy. Alright, let me get rid of that, and let's go back to these curve tools. So, what good are these curves? Curves are kind of cool because we can essentially use them to draw out shapes like wires and things really easily, instead of going in and using our bend tool that we talked about earlier, and piping and things like that. So let's actually sketch one more curve on this. I'm just going to do something simple like that. I'm going to stretch this point out as well, and this one. Okay. So on the mesh item itself, I have its properties down here, and there's an option for curve. Now, by default, this is all going to be turned on or turned off, but if you turn on render curves, you're not going to see anything. However, if we look at the preview, let's pull this over, hit play, and look at our object. So let's press Shift A here. Alright, so right now you can kind of see this line showing up. If I zoom in quite a bit, you'll start to see that that is our curve. Oh, right there. Okay. If I turn this off, that's not going to do anything, so it's not going to show up. But if I turn it back on, I have my curve there. I can change the radius of that curve, which is the thickness. And if I zoom out, we should see, whoa, this big mess. So let's drop that back down. And you can kind of see, like, we can use this to make our wires and cabling and, you know, railings and things like that. We can also hit the M key here and give it a material. Okay. We can additionally go in back to the curve properties. We can change what part of this curve is actually rendering. So right now it's a percentage from 0 to 100 from my first point to my last point, and that is the curve start and end. So if I say, actually, let's start this at 30%, it's going to go from 30% to 100%. If I was to say, let's go from 0 to 50, it's only going to do half of the curve. And these are values that later on we can animate, so we can make it look like our curve is growing over time. Okay. We also have the option to render these curves instead of these like perfectly round shapes. We can render them as polygons. So you can see right now what it looks like here. If I turn on render as polygons, I can determine how many sides I want on that polygon. So if you wanted like a triangle wire or something, you could set this to 3 sides. And we have this triangle shape. If it needed to be flat, you could do 2D, but you want to keep it above 3 usually, or 3 and above. 4 sides, 5 sides, 6 sides. If you needed something that specific, you know, the option is there. Okay. So again, for wires especially, curves are your friend. The other nice thing about curves is that you can always let me actually select mesh item. If we go to vertices, you can see they don't show up easily, but you can actually move them around. You might not have access to those handlebars to go in and edit those. However, you can move the points, and they don't have to be flat, right? Like I'm drawing them in my top view, so they're coming out flat, but I can of course move these however I want after the fact. Right? Yeah, so that's our curve tool. Now let's take a look at some of our duplication tools. Alright, so I have a new scene here with the teapot primitive. I'm going to go into duplicate, and we're just going to talk about a couple of these. The first thing you want to know is that a lot of these tools are context sensitive, meaning if I'm in item mode like I am right now, these tools will duplicate the item, and usually they're indicated by this purple icon, versus if I go into polygon mode, you'll see they turn green. However, this does apply to the other tools that don't change color as well. So for example, if I go back to item mode, I'm going to start off with this mirrored tool, right? So I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to click in my viewport to activate it, and you'll see right away it is mirroring over that object and gives me this kind of square here. The square will be controlled by these two handles, so the larger cyan cube here will be the position of my mirror. You can see if I move this further, that's going to get further. And the smaller cube here will be my rotation. So you can kind of imagine this as a kind of mirror going in infinite directions or infinite distance, left and right, up and down, and copying whatever I had selected. Whoops, let me move that back here. yeah, it's going to copy whatever I had selected on the other side of this, and as it's only going to give me one copy of everything. And as soon as I hit the space bar to drop my tool, you'll see I have the second teapot item that I can do with as I please. Now if I go back to this teapot and go to that same mirror tool, sorry, before I do that, escape, I'm going to actually click on polygon mode, and remember, not having any polygon selected is the same as having all of them selected. Mirror tool, click. This time around, it's actually not creating a new mesh item. It's adding these this copy of the polygons in my scene, in my object. And so if I was to hit spacebar here, you can see this kind of hard to control in the perspective view, so you might want to try playing around with the other views, but for now we'll be fine. I'm going to hit the space bar, and you'll notice that that is in one mesh item. I could always pull that mesh item out, or pull this out by selecting all of it. Control X to cut, N for a new mesh item, Control V to paste. But it's easier to just be in item mode to be able to do that from the beginning. All right. One last thing, of course, you can, if we look at if we just selected these polygons and then we hit mirror, you're going to see it's just going to mirror the selected polygons. Let's rotate this around that way and move it over. You'll also notice we do have in our tool properties, which is again under the K key, you can change which axis you're mirroring on. So if I wanted to mirror on my x-axis, I could do that. And if I had this kind of flat, it would be right above my original object. So just keep that in mind. All right. The meshes are going to, or if you're in polygon mode, it's going to copy the polygons, and it's only going to be copying the selected polygons. All right. So let's look at some of the other tools we have here. Let's start with a cylinder this time. So first, let's look at our clone tool. I'm going to click on it and click in my viewport, and it's going to let me click and drag this one point in the middle, and it's gonna essentially copy the item that I have selected and let me select an offset from that item and then copy that over. Now this isn't the result you'll get out of the box. This is because I had some options set up here, but by default you'll probably get something like 100%, whoops, 100, 100, and 0. Okay, so you'll get something like this. You'll move this out and you'll say, okay, well, that's essentially the same thing as me duplicating the object and moving it, right? And it is. And you'll notice I have this kind of purple indicator showing me how far it's moved from the original object, the offset of it, and that is this value. Now if I increase my number of clones, you're going to see it's going to add copies with that same offset from the previous copy. Additionally, if I was to say, let's do like 10, also this will be off by default, we'll talk about that in a second. Alright, so we have 10 copies, we have this offset and it's going to copy that offset however I move this. We can also offset the scale, so I can say, oh, this is going to be 110%, the X scale. Let's do all three. So a quick trick here, if I click on this button, it's going to set these to equal temporarily, and so if I edit the first value here, it's going to edit all three to 110. So this is 10% bigger, this is 10% bigger than that, this is 10% bigger than that, so on and so forth. And I can also do the same thing for rotate. So let's rotate in my x-axis. We'll do 20 degrees. 20 degrees, there we go. So 20 degrees and 40 and 60 and 80. But it's always 20 more than the previous clone. Alright, so That's kind of all the options we are concerned with for now. The item effector down here, which is going to be in most of our cloning tools and array tools, is kind of useful for keeping your scene clean. By default, it will be set to off, meaning all these objects will show up underneath your main scene. And if we change this to hierarchy, under your main original object, you're going to have the first copy, and underneath that, you're going to have the second copy, and so on and so forth. We can change this to root, meaning all the copies are under the original object. And we can change this to primary, which is just going to create a group underneath your original object and kind of put it in there. Okay? I'm going to set this to group just so I can delete them easily. Yes. That error message, or that warning message rather, said that, hey, you're about to delete this item that has other items underneath it. Are you sure you want to delete it? And that's exactly why I was using it, so that's fine. Alright, let's look at the curve clone tool here. So actually, before I do that, I'm going to just grab these points, actually delete this polygon, grab these points, and go to vertex tools and join average and make a clone out of it. And let's go back to our duplicate tool, and I'm going to go into one of the 2D views here because I tend to go into these views whenever I'm using any type of curve tool. Just easier for me to draw with a predictable result. So in my front view, I'm going to use my curve clone tool. I'm going to click in my viewport, and it's going to draw out a curve, and you can kind of see it's doing the same behavior as we did with the curve tools, where I can select the point, move it around, click somewhere else to add it. If we hit the K key, you'll see we have the option for add, edit, or delete. We also have this option to, we also have our item effector options, just like we had before. And we have the option to align to path, which is on by default. If we turn that off, you'll see all of our objects kind of align to the same orientation as the original object had. You'll also notice that in this tool, you'll always have one copy at the start of the curve and one copy at the end of the curve. So let me turn align to path back on. Align to normal will kind of help the clones follow the path, so you can kind of see it's a slight adjustment, but it just attaches that kind of y-axis to the top. The align to path will kind of change depending on where you started drawing your first object. So you can see if I have this point kind of towards the side of this, like that, it's going to at some point flip. So you might need to play around with it a little bit to kind of get it to align the way you want. Let me keep this open. All right. Start at source will say that no matter where I drew the curve, that first clone should be exactly where the original item was. All right, and yeah, we can also close this loop, so we'll kind of close that and then add the other point. I personally like by length over here, which will more evenly distribute the clones along your curve, so you can kind of see the difference that it's making there. You'll notice that wherever I have sharp turns, it's going to by default add more clones than where I have kind of straight lines. So the by length will say evenly distribute these 13 or 20 copies along that curve. You'll notice here that it's called steps instead of number of clones. Same, really like the same thing. All right. Automatic will actually automatically set your number of clones based off of the curvature and the length of it and all. I tend to not use it because it can get kind of unwieldy. Remember, you're adding a ton more polygons for each clone, so just keep that in mind. All right. And again, you know, right now I had this in item mode. You could do the same thing in polygon mode. And work the same way. Alright, let's look at scatter clone next. So if I click on this and click in my viewport, it's going to essentially give me this move tool with kind of the scale tool around it. Okay, so the move tool is we're essentially defining a box for our copies to live in, and the move tool is going to say this is where the center of the box is, and then the scale tool is going to say for this distance in both positive and negative direction, like define a box that is holding these copies. Okay, so make that box a little bit bigger, and all my copies will be randomly placed within that box. Okay, I can have my count here, changes the number of copies I have. The center is of course the center, the range is the scale, the sorry, the range is like the defining scale for that box. Okay, the scale here is going to be the scale of the objects, and you'll see they'll randomize from the original percentage to, let's say, 10% more. And they're not all going to be the same, so if we go back to like 50% there, 0, 0, you'll notice some are scaled and some aren't, and some are in the middle and some are the original size. So it's just going to randomize that. And same thing for rotation. If we say like 25 degrees, it's going to rotate anywhere from negative 25 to plus 25 degrees from the original rotation. Okay. Again, we have the item effector here, so I'm going to change that to primary just to make that easier to delete and get rid of that. And let's look at the array tool next. So if I go to array here, the array tool is very similar to the scatter clone. Lets me define kind of like a space to have these copies. This one's a little bit easier to see using the tool properties. So count is how many copies you have in each axis. So let's say I want 3 in X. Let's do 5 in Y, and we'll do 4 in Z, right? And it's going to kind of nicely arrange all of those. Now, the offset here will be the distance between the first copy and the next copy. So let's say in the x-axis we want a distance of 2 meters. In the y-axis we want a distance of 3 meters. So it's 3 from here to here, 3 from here to here. And then in z we want 1.5. Okay. Now jitter here will be kind of randomizing on top of these offset values. So if I say in my z-axis I want a jitter of 0.5, that means that now the z offset will be anywhere between 1 meter and 2 meters, right, from the previous copy. And you'll notice that sometimes we will have things interact, because this is probably more than 1.5 and this is less than 1.5. So you want to be a little bit careful. Remember that you don't have to settle for whatever results it gives you. You do have the option for going in and deleting these the ones that you don't like the position of. So just keep that in mind. Let me change that jitter back to 0. Now the scale here will be global for everything. So like if I was to say scale this to 10% in Y, everything's gonna get scaled down, right? Let's do 20. That, right? Rotation as well. If I rotate 50 degrees in Z, it's going to rotate 50 degrees everywhere. Okay, all of them are going to rotate the same amount. Move this over. So you'll notice that the first one does not get made, so it counts this as your first one. All right. So even though we've rotated all these and everything, that first copy is not going to be a separate item. Okay. Then we have one of my favorites to play around with, the radial array. So The radial array can be kind of tricky to play around with at first. If we just click on it and click in our viewport, it's going to give us these 3 points. Now as soon as I move this away from my original object by grabbing that larger square, we're going to start to see what it's doing. It's copying that object in a ring. First things first, we have our count, number of copies. We have the axis that we want to kind of make these copies around. So that's my x-axis, this is my y-axis, this is my z-axis. In this case, I probably have to move it further away from my z point to kind of get it to where I want. I'm going to go back to x for now, or sorry, y for now. And you'll notice that there's these 2 boxes to the left and right. So the center of this is going to essentially make the ring smaller or bigger or smaller. The side boxes here will essentially let me rotate that, so I don't have to stick to x, y, or z. I can actually be on an axis, or a combination of those axes rather. And you can already see like we're getting some pretty cool looking results, right? We also have the start and end angle. So like, let's say we don't want our ring to go a full 360 degrees. We can say make our copies over half of that, and still going to do 24 copies over that distance. We can also say the other half, so we can go from 180 to 360 like that. And then we have this offset, which is going to be in our axis, the distance between the first object and the second object. So in y right now the offset is 0. If I was to set this to 1, now my offset is a little bit higher over here, 1 meter up compared to that one. This will be easier to see if we go to 0 to 360. So you can see like this is where we're starting, it's going around, and we're ending up 1 meter higher. What's really cool about this is if we were to say offset is like 6 meters, right? We can get these nice spirals. And if we were to say we're gonna do more than 360 degrees, and remember we can do math here, so we can say let's rotate around this 5 times. Now we have 5 rotations going around and kind of going up. However, we don't have enough copies to really see that well, so let's actually multiply this by 5 as well. And now we have all these copies. We can change the offset here to be much higher. We can also still change our axis. So if I was to grab that center and move it away from the origin point, I get a wider circle. And if I grab one of these edges here, I can kind of rotate it. And you can see things are slowing down a little bit, but that's fine. And you can see we have a pretty cool result, right? I hit spacebar to drop that tool. However, I didn't set my item effector. So I'm just going to select all those and ditch them. Yes. Alright. One thing about the item effector mode and just how that stuff works, it's creating some kind of parenting relationship between your objects. So I did want to touch on that. We will touch on this again when we're looking at animating, but just so you have an idea of how this works. If we have these 2 objects together and we were trying to rotate them, you'll notice by default they're both going to rotate their individual centers. If we wanted to, say, have this cube rotate around this cylinder or cone, I can select the cube and just drag it into the cylinder object, and it's going to essentially put it underneath it. And this is going to create a parent and child relationship between these 2 objects. Now, wherever the parent moves, or however it rotates, or however it scales, the child will kind of copy that. However, the child can still, on its own, move, rotate, and scale. Okay? So, it's kind of a good way to keep your scene together and move things around, especially in that first assignment where we're modeling like a scene and we want to make sure everything is positioned relative to each other. So, that is an option for you, and it's pretty quick and easy. And we're not limited to 2 things like you saw with the hierarchy mode. So if I was to throw in a torus here and say, oh, this is going to be underneath the cube at all times, like that, attach that to the cube. Now I have 3 layers in this hierarchy. If I was to grab this item and move it, all of them will move together. If I grab the cube and the torus will move together. And if I still wanted to, I could grab the torus and change its position. Alright? So yeah, we'll be talking about that a little bit more when we're doing animation stuff where we're moving things together and all that. But it is a good way to, especially in the beginning, just scale everything together rather than like if I was to undo this, which, let me just go back to perspective here. You can just drag any of these back into your main scene. You can't really do that after you've started animating, but before you start animating, you could definitely just unparent things like that. And if I go to scale all of these now, you'll see that they're kind of like intersecting with each other, right? Versus if I undo till I'm parented again, like that. Now I'm just going to scale this one, and they'll all scale together nicely, right? If I was to grab all 3, you'll see I still have kind of the same behavior. It's slightly different because it's scaling from the center of my selection, but yeah, it's just very useful for when you're arranging things that you've already modeled, especially if you're bringing them in from other scenes. Now that I've said that, let me just show you. If I have a new scene here, I can always grab an object and pull it into the scene, and it will ask me what I want to import. I always want the children, meaning the objects underneath it, and I always want my shaders if I had assigned any. Hit OK, and now those objects are in this scene. Alright, so simple as that. I guess just one more thing you guys should know is about saving for this assignment, right? So